All right, I am now joined by our good friend Gene Bajalan, uh, and what I was kind of hoping for this is the first of the patron bonus episodes that we're doing for starting for the new year. And what I was kind of thinking, for this episode is that this would be something of a beginner's guide to the history and politics of Kurdistan for the benefit of American leftists who might have a vague idea, might know a little bit, might know almost nothing, and to sort of start to give them a little bit of a grounding. But before we get into all of that, we should. I think since Gene has obviously been on the show and on YouTube live streams, several times before. But whenever I've done it, I've always figured, people who watch or listen to GTAA basically know who Gene is. He's a beloved character in the Michael Brooks extended universe. But I thought that for our purposes today, given the subject matter, it might be interesting to start by telling the audience a little bit about your background personally and academically, as as it relates to all of this, and to sort of get us started that way. And then when we get into the meat of it, I figure this is the first of many conversations we're going to have about this stuff, so we don't need to worry too much about what gets covered or doesn't get covered today.
Sure. Okay. Well, yeah. So I am today a historian, academic working at Missouri State University. I teach Middle Eastern history here, and I run the graduate program, and I work a lot with with undergraduates, but also high school teachers, people who are either training to become high school teachers or are high school teachers getting a graduate degree. And so I got this job in Missouri in 2016, just before Trump came to power. That was also when I first got to know Michael as well. After I moved to the United Kingdom and moved to the United States. Previously, I'd been in Iraq, and yeah, I've been here ever since. And it's a job that I really like. I really like working with teachers. I'm really proud to work at a public institution. So that's sort of what I do now. My background is I was born and brought up in the United Kingdom. I was born in Birmingham, but at the age of 2, I moved to Kingston upon Hull, which is a large city in Yorkshire. My mother is from Wales, and my father was from Iraqi Kurdistan. So growing up, I was I was in a predominantly white city, in a predominantly European white European context. There was one other Kurd living in Hull at the time who my dad didn't talk to, because my dad had found out that this other Kurdish guy had sold out to Saddam Hussein, and my dad was a former activist in the 1970s who didn't exactly flee Iraq, but left as the situation got bad for Kurds in the late 1970s. Throughout the 60s, there was a ongoing guerrilla warfare taking place in Iraq. The main led by the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which was kind of the hegemonic party of that era. In the early 70s, there was a peace agreement with the Iraqi government, and that was a lot of Kurds at that time hoped that the Ba'athist government of Saddam Hussein. Well, Saddam was not yet the ruler, but he was a powerful individual. A lot of Kurds hoped that a solution had been arrived at, autonomy would be implemented. But by the mid-70s, that dream had kind of collapsed, and many Kurdish activists and intellectuals decided, either fled or they got jobs. My father was a medical doctor. He'd been trained at the University of Baghdad, which had a British curriculum, a hangover from the colonial period in Iraq. The University of Baghdad Medical School ran the University of Edinburgh curriculum, and my father, as the son of a Kurdish aristocrat, had, been afforded the opportunity to go to Baghdad College, a Jesuit college run by Americans. So he spoke English. He went to the English-speaking medical school in Baghdad, was a qualified medical doctor. So it was relatively easy for him in the 70s to find a job in the National Health Service in the United Kingdom, which was at that time, a very attractive job for medical professionals. A lot of the mythology in America about medical professionals is that they're all poverty-stricken outside of the United States. Only America pays medical doctors well. I will say, yes, in America, medical doctors get paid probably better, but they have a lot more insurance to pay. And my father did pretty good. He has a summer home in Spain now, so he was a medical doctor in the universal healthcare system of the United Kingdom. So I was kind of brought up in this context in a largely European background, but with a connection to my Middle Eastern origins, with a connection to the Kurdish cause, something that I was very exposed to growing up. And as a teenager, it was something that I never felt like particularly bullied or oppressed, or I don't have a story about how I felt excluded. I played Dungeons and Dragons at high school, but I was also a champion rugby player, and I did athletics. So I was, we didn't really have this kind of divide between jocks and nerds and things like that. I got on with everybody, had a good time, and I always took pride in, being a little bit different and having a kind of having a connection to a different part of the world. And when I went to university, I became more and more interested, especially I moved away from my hometown to London, and I became more and more interested in the Kurdish community. At this time in the late 90s, early 2000s, this coincided with the capture of Abdullah Öcalan, the PKK leader. It coincided with a major campaign, environmental campaign against the Ilisu Dam project, which has now, it's now been completed, but destroyed a very important Kurdish historical site, an important Islamic historical site, the city of Hasankeyf, which was the last bastion of the Ayyubid dynasty, the dynasty of Saladin Ayyubi from the Crusades, who you may all know. So this was this kind of atmosphere of activism, and generally left-orientated activism as well. Very much attracted me at the time. So I became interested both in my studies, and then I became, I really enjoyed history. So I went on and studied history. I did my undergraduate at the London School of Oriental and African Studies, one of the best places in Britain if you want to study non-European history. It was a former colonial training school set up in 1916 to train officials for the British Empire. And, in the 70s and 80s, it became a kind of hippy-dippy place where everybody smoked weed, but at the same time, the MI6 would come try and recruit people. It's a weird place. There, I got to personally argue with George Galloway, and all these people would turn up because it's in the heart of London. And for some weird, this is something Michael Brooks always used to badger me about, was like, SOAS had the reputation that in the bar was the place, if you didn't know who to get weed from in London, the SOAS bar was, you just go to the SOAS bar and someone will hook you up, no problem. So, this was the kind of atmosphere, very international. Then I went on, I went to work in Iraq after that, in Iraqi Kurdistan, teaching in the university, teaching English, working at a newspaper there, an English language newspaper, went back, continued my studies at the London School of Economics, got really good interested in Ottoman history and this kind of prehistory of the Kurdish question, and Ottoman history and more generally, because the Ottoman Empire was the major power in the Middle East for 3-4 centuries. And it's kind of less so today, but it's a kind of forgotten legacy, and it's such an important legacy, especially the 19th century, where a lot of this mythology about Islam being hostile, Islamic societies being hostile to democracy, or there being no indigenous democratic traditions in the Middle East and things like that. A lot of that mythology falls apart when you start examining the legacy of Ottoman history, and not to sort of paint the Ottoman Empire with rose-tinted glasses, but it it gives us a very kind of like different perspective on the Middle East. So I became interested in that. I moved to Turkey for 4 years because I was like, well, I need to learn Turkish. So I stayed there for 4 years, studied at a Turkish university, did a master's degree in history there, and then went back to England to finish my doctoral work at Oxford. In my final year, as you know, Ben, funding dries up and you need a job really badly. And before I'd finished my PhD, I got a job at the American University of Iraq in Suleymaniye, which was it was a university established by sort of neoconservatives as part of, and some.
So this is your second stint in Iraq at this point.
Yeah, my second stint in Iraq. So it was kind of this. Oh, sorry about that. Neoconservative institution, which gradually the neoconservatives, at least on the faculty, had kind of abandoned it because the Iraqi project had fallen to bits, but still had many people on the board who were very associated with the Iraq War. People like Dov Sakhaim, who was one of Rumsfeld's deputies. While I was there, Petraeus came to visit the university. The university leadership, the university was run by Barham Saleh, who was a leading member of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, which is a breakaway party from the KDP formed in the 70s. He'd previously been that party's representative in Washington in the run-up to the Iraq War, and then he became a national security advisor in the occupation government. And today he's now president of Iraq. When he was kind of leading the American University of Iraq in Suleymaniye, his political star was kind of at its nadir. But he would run these big kind of conferences every year where we'd have people like Petraeus come. Thomas Friedman, he was a big fan of Thomas Friedman. So I got my wife got to work with Thomas Friedman, who, well, let's just say there's some stories around there. So, worked there for 2 years.
I understand you probably can't tell him, but God, I'd love to hear this.
You'll have to talk to my wife about having to deal with Thomas Friedman, because interestingly enough, Friedman had gone to the same Oxford College as my wife and I as well. So there was a kind of so it was kind of like, oh, you guys are from St. Anthony's as well, which St. Anthony's is kind of like, it's a new college. It's not like one of these historical colleges. It's a graduate college, and it's a college that is associated with espionage and spies. I think it's in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and it's also in a very British coup. So always very shady characters end up coming out of St. Anthony's College. When I was there, St. Anthony was very proud that there were apparently, and I may get this wrong, but apparently 6 members of the Colombian cabinet were former St. Anthony's College people. Although, there's, so people, it kind of operated as a finishing school for international students or internationally orientated American students. So, for example, one of my people I went to university with is now went on to work for Kamala Harris and now works for AOC. So, it's kind of interesting thing. So I met my wife there and everything like that. Anyway, after working in Iraq, things were driving me crazy working there. And this job at Missouri State came up. I applied, and I was very fortunate to get it. And it's kind of it's an interesting job. Like I said, it's a lot of people who enter academia, they really want to shoot for these like high-end research jobs. But I enjoy teaching. I enjoy hearing the sound of my own voice, I suppose. And I ended up I really like the opportunity to work with people who are not from an elite background. When I was a PhD student, I taught people who were fancy pants people in Britain and things like that. And it was an interesting experience. Often they were very good at knowing how to do the patter. They sort of were able to talk very well. But I enjoy working with people who are interested, hardworking, and don't come from those elite and privileged backgrounds. And I find it very rewarding. And I hope my students find it rewarding too. So, that's kind of a summary of who I am. So I'm of Kurdish origin, but, I'm brought up in Britain and I've traveled around and, yes, I've seen the Middle East and I've seen Europe. And now I have the good fortune to live in the, what I'm told is the greatest country on the planet.
Well, certainly not in terms of healthcare or education or anything unimportant like that. But yeah, fair enough. So by the way, one thing I do want to flag before we go on, what did you argue with George Galloway about?
Oh yeah, so this was just in the run up to the Iraq War. So like in the run up to the Iraq War, as someone of Iraqi Kurdish origins, it was a bit of a tough situation because I was opposed to the war, but also I was not in favor of glorifying the Iraqi regime and George Galloway was very slippery about this because at times he would praise the Iraqi regime, praise the Ba'athist regime, depending on the audience. And then at other times he'd be like, no, of course they're a terrible dictatorial regime. So there was a very kind of slipperiness of that. And actually I argued to him with specifically was like, and he did this in the end actually, but I can't remember actually, he might have been kicked out. But I said, if it's so bad, and you can't go behind it, why don't you resign from the Labour Party? And he blathered on that point. But he did end up going and joining Respect, which was a kind of left-wing, a kind of political manifestation of the anti-war movement in Britain at the time. He had this group called Respect. It was dominated by members of the Socialist Workers' Party, which is not the Socialist Workers' Party that you have in America. I think that there is a Socialist Workers' Party in America, but it's different from the one.
Yeah. So for better or for worse, I do know my sectariana, and they have a common ancestor, but they're very different. So they both come out of some version of Leon Trotsky's attempt to form a Fourth International in the 30s, which. And I shouldn't even say that as if like, oh, of course everybody knows what the hell that is. But there had been, these various times in socialist history, there have been these kind of grand international alliances of workers or socialist parties, starting with the First International, which Marx and Engels and also anarchists like Bakunin were involved in. Second International, which sort of still exists in an extremely degenerate form. The DSA in the United States used to be affiliated with it, but it actually severed that tie a few years ago because in the decades since that they had become affiliated with it, it had just become this bizarre formation that included parties like the ruling Mubarak's party from Egypt and stuff like that. The Third International, which was the Communist International, Comintern, and then after Joseph Stalin took over that, Trotsky tried to start a Fourth International, which never really went anywhere in terms of actually having like mass parties that could play a real role in their country's politics. But it did give rise to about 1,000 different fragments over time, and the sort of like trying to keep track of the Brownian motion of the splits and fusions of different Trotskyists is probably an impossible task. But basically the group in America calling itself the Socialist Workers' Party, which was founded in the 30s, and the group in the UK call itself the Socialist Workers' Party, which was founded by Tony Cliff in the 70s. Just to draw another connection here, the predecessor organization of the SWP in the UK was called the International Socialists, and that's as good an excuse as any. Here's to talk about one of the most famous alumni of that organization. So here's a quick clip of him.
What's the flagging around?
That is the flag of Kurdistan. The Kurdish people are the largest people in the world, the largest ethnic group, if you like, largest nation. They don't have a state. The Qatari and Kuwaiti royal families have a seat at the vote of the United Nations. The Kurdish people, who are perhaps as many as 35 million, don't have any diplomatic representation at all. But they are a big part of Free Iraq. And so I wear the flag as a sign of solidarity with the revolution in Iraq that removed Saddam Hussein, defeated Al-Qaeda, and is trying to build a republic.
So that, of course, would be Christopher Hitchens, who in his decade since being a young Trotskyist was mostly good for a few more decades, and then took a turn after 9/11, which I certainly regard as a moral and political disaster. But part of the way that he came to this is through organically, right? I mean, I've always argued that it's a mistake to sort of see Hitchens' bad foreign policy turn as just a matter of him being a sellout or a grifter or anything, rather than him making an effort to, coming from a good place in some ways and making some very severe wrong turns. And by the way, just to tie up this thread, I should say that in a couple of weeks, Gene and I and our friend David Slavic will be watching on the YouTube live stream Christopher Hitchens' debate about Iraq with George Galloway. But I think this is actually not entirely a side trip, right, from where we want to go, because I think that what you're talking about with Galloway, what I was just talking about with Hitchens, does tie into something that happens sometimes when the Western left tries to grapple with American intervention in the Middle East and how that relates to the Kurdish liberation struggle. And people can, I think, go very far off the rails in one of a couple of different directions, probably more than those, but certainly at least these couple, which are, one is the Hitchens way, which is that if you're identifying with vulnerable and oppressed minorities within Middle Eastern nations that might see themselves in the crosshairs of American imperialism, that you start to see American empire as an ally in that fight, and you end up supporting crimes against humanity. That's obviously bad. But the other way is the Galloway way, right? Which without necessarily naming any names, I've seen some recent examples of on the online left, which is to say, well, I don't want to be a stooge for American imperialism. Therefore, I'm going to be completely dismissive of the struggles of oppressed people in places like Iraq or even Turkey, which is a NATO ally. So that you'd think that would be an anti-imperialist gimme, to care, about Turkish Kurds. But for example, when Donald Trump, withdrew some American forces, from that were part of an intervention in Syria, and thus abandoned the Kurds in Rojava to the potentially genocidal attentions of the Turkish military. There were people who were celebrating that as like a great anti-imperialist victory.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes, that speaks to some of the problems people have when they're like reviewing and trying to conceptualize like what kind of political stance they should have in the Middle East. Take, for example, Syria in general. Like one can be opposed to the United States firing off missiles against the Assad regime or taking military action against the Assad regime to, regime change or what have you, without glorifying what the Assad regime is. You get these kind of ridiculous statements that, the Assad regime is like leading socialism, or like the Iranian regime is leading, the Iranian regime to some extent is fighting, anti-imperialism, but that doesn't mean that the Iranian regime is positive for the citizens of Iran.
No, and even the sort of moderate versions of these, which like the more understated versions of these claim, which is, there's a certain way to be, I think, a lazy anti-imperialist, which, whatever. I'm 40, so I'm just barely old enough to remember this as a teenage lefty, seeing people do this with regards to like Slobodan Milosevic in the 90s, and then of course more recently with Assad and and others, which is where you say, well, you can't exactly pretend that these people are revolutionary communists, because they're clearly nothing of the kind, but you can at least say, oh, these people were some sort of thorn in the side of global neoliberalism or something. And usually if you look into the details, it's total bullshit. That they were never, any such thing really. But yeah, so I think that there is a line to walk there, and I think it comes up in a lot more context than this one. which is to say, like, you don't want to be drawn into making excuses, for Western imperialism by the very real crimes of these regimes. But you also don't want to deny those crimes for a number of reasons, not least of which is that if part of the reason that you're interested in anti-imperialism in the first place is that you want to, be in solidarity, with people and, oppressed people and in other side, parts of the world. And, then I think making excuses for regimes that suppress their own working class and national minorities, is, really, really flies in the face of that. I think there's a real failure of solidarity that, that some people on the Western left can very easily, fall into because the world is complicated, and even relationships between liberation struggles and foreign empires are historically extremely complicated. If you take the position I see some people take when they're talking about something like Rojava, where they'll say, well, basically anybody who accepts any sort of aid from an imperialist power is nothing but an extension of that, and there's no reason to support them. Well, try to apply that to any previous historical revolution literally ever, whether we're talking obviously about the the United States becoming independent from Britain, with massive help from Louis XVI, or
the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, the Russian Revolution,
where Germany allowed Lenin to return to Russia.
Or
through its territory.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the sealed train, absolutely. Or like the Haitian Revolution, which we just passed the anniversary of. There were certainly key points where the slave rebels in Haiti wouldn't have been able to hold on if not for aid from the Spanish Empire. Whether basically up until the 20th century, at which point the Soviet Union could play the role of the rival power giving aid to liberation struggles, then it was always the case, that there was some sort of, that like successful revolutions tended to, from the Haitian Revolution to the Russian Revolution to wherever, right, tended to rely on some sort of, exploiting rivalries between different powers, that they could gain some kind of advantage from, which, you can, I guess you maybe get to leftist heaven sooner if you don't do that, but you're a lot less likely to win.
I mean, and even if we can criticize political leadership, we should at least be able to show empathy. So, okay, if people want to criticize the leadership of Rojava for taking aid from the United States when they were in a tough military position, well, that's fair enough. But not understanding why they would do that in the first place, or why Kurds and other minorities in Rojava are suspicious of the Syrian government, or why Iraqi Kurds would not want to sort of join an anti-imperialist front with Saddam Hussein to fight against American intervention. Not understanding that and not kind of putting that into a historical context just leads to I guess bad politics, because these regimes like the Syrian regime, like Saddam, like Gaddafi, they can turn on a dime in many ways. Gaddafi, enemy number one for a long time, went back to being friends for a while when he disarmed. You had Tony Blair, you had I think it was, what's his name, Held from the LSE. They all, the London School of Economics even gave Gaddafi's son a PhD, for which everyone calls them now the Libyan School of Economics. There was a time where Gaddafi was totally fine with the, with the international order. So, these guys weren't opposing the United States on principle. Even within the Islamic Republic of Iran,
yeah,
the main political divide between reformists and hardliners, there is a kind of difference on the domestic agenda, but more important is the foreign policy agenda, because the reformists want to have some kind of normalization with the United States. At the end of the day, Iran's foreign policy since the Second World War hasn't really changed. It's always been to be like the dominant power in the Persian Gulf and then project that power. It's just up until 79, they did it with the support of the United States, and after 79, they did it in opposition to the United States.
Opposition for the most part, although even there, it's worth recalling that has, there are some significant exceptions, right? Let's say that I mean, obviously, infamously, the Reagan administration was using them as part of a scheme to fund the Contra death squads fighting against the essentially democratic socialist government in Nicaragua. So if we're going to talk about alliances with imperialism, that's a significant one. And then the arms for hostages scandal, but then also much more recently, comparatively speaking, about halfway in between, not that they were actually supplying soldiers or planes directly, but as I understand it, I mean, Iran was basically an ally of the initial U.S. intervention in Afghanistan.
Not only that, I used to watch Iranian state television in the late 1990s, and they called the Northern Alliance the Islamic government of Afghanistan. Not only that, there were tensions in the late 1990s where Iran massed troops on the borders with Afghanistan, and not only that, my wife, who lived in Mashhad, which is in Khorasan, which is the province next to Afghanistan, remembers the fear of a war, in the between the Taliban and Iran during that time. And in the late 1990s, it looked like Pakistan and the United States were tilting towards the Taliban on this kind of issue. So there's a lot.
Because because the United States actually did. I mean, look, the United States gave the Taliban, after they completely took over, money to pursue, the war on drugs, and there was definitely a possibility of alliance there. So so both and then conversely.
Rambo 3 was entirely dedicated to the heroic Mujahideen of Afghanistan, if memory serves.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, it's the dedication at the end that Ronald Reagan, said that they were like the founding fathers. So, which it's amazing how quickly that got memory hold. But yeah, I mean, it is also. But then conversely, when the United States invaded Afghanistan to topple the Taliban. As you say, Iranian state TV, was friendly to that, and also, in fact, I remember reading at the time that Iran was allowing the invading alliance to use its airspace to go into to Afghanistan, because obviously, obviously they'd had a history of tensions, with the Taliban from the word go, because the Taliban, were obviously, extreme anti-Shiite fanatics, so that's extremely unsurprising. So all of which is just to say that I think you need to, whatever you think the right answers are here, you do need to disaggregate the issues, and saying, imperialism bad is a good first step, right? I mean, that's the beginning of wisdom, but it's certainly not the end of it. And if you say imperialism is bad, therefore whoever is in any sort of short-term tactical alliance with it is bad, and whoever's opposed to it is good, then you end up becoming very confused, since then everybody's bad and everybody's good. But I do want to back up, because over the course of the discussion so far, we've thrown out a few names that not everybody might be familiar with: PKK, KDP, Rojava, and I want to get into at least some of that in the limited time we have today. But also, I don't know. Sometimes I think, part of what I want to do with this is for somebody who might be somebody, who obviously, listens to or watches left media, or else they wouldn't run into this, and so might know a little bit of this, but I want to have like an entry ramp here for somebody who might know, basically nothing about this. So, in the sort of spirit of, I remember, a driver's ed teacher that I had when I was 16, who would literally start by holding up a car key and say, "This goes in the ignition," so we're talking. I don't, we don't need to go back, centuries or anything here, but we're talking, as Hitch said in that clip, about a group of people spread throughout, several different countries. So you want to just sort of start us off in this sort of view from 10,000 feet about, what group we're talking about, where they are, what the, like the sort of the ABCs before we get it more into the specific organizations.
Sure. So when we think of the Middle East, we think of, the Middle East is not all Arabs. It's a diverse region. So we can talk about an Arab community. We can talk about a Turkish community. We can talk about a Persian/Iranian community. We can talk about an Afghan or a Pashtun community. And we can talk about a Kurdish community. So the Kurds are one of these kind of communities living in the Middle East. What makes it complicated is, of course, all these communities that I've mentioned historically are very diverse. An Arab in Iraq is not the same as an Arab in Morocco. A Persian from Shiraz in Iran is not exactly the same as a Persian speaker from Tajikistan. And of course, Kurds in the same way are a very diverse community. The Kurds are spread over a large territory, a mountainous region stretching from northwestern Iran, what is northwestern Iran today, through the mountainous regions of northern Iraq, into southeastern Turkey, bits in Armenia, a little bit stripped down in Syria as well. So they're a kind of a people who live in this contiguous zone. Historically, they lived intermingled with other communities. That there are communities of Arabs, Turks, Persians, and of course, historically, Armenians lived very interspersed with Kurds. In fact, many Armenians spoke Kurdish, but were defined as Armenians because they practiced the Armenian Orthodox religion as well. So, when we talk historically, nations nations are modern constructs. And the modern Kurdish nation is built out of this diversity, this diverse sort of Kurdish cultural milieu.
Which I should just jump in real quick here to say that I think perhaps the least of Stalin's crimes as far as as far as direct effect on the world, but one that I find a little bit annoying is that Joseph Stalin, in the early history of the Bolshevik Party, wrote this very famous pamphlet on the right of nations to self-determination. So, for example, if you read like Richard Wright's memoir, he talks about how big that book was for him. It's been very, it's very influential in the early communist movement, and even lots of people, who aren't exactly Stalinists, that sort of think, okay, well, this is like the closest we have to a sort of Marxist classic on this idea. And I've seen some people use this to say, oh, well, look, what are you talking about, Kurdish nation? Because here's Stalin's checklist. For right of nations to self-determination, and it's language, culture, blah blah blah, and there's this whole checklist, and you could say, oh, but look, it's a diverse group of people that don't all share the checklist, but the thing is, nobody does.
Yeah, I mean that's what it comes down to. From the late, and this sort of, I guess, diverts us into a bit of a discussion on sort of theories of nationalism per se, but you have kind of two predominant schools: those who see the nation as a kind of objective, structure, and those who see it as entirely subjective. And it's very difficult to come down on one side or another because to some degree you might argue that nations have a certain objective connections with them, whether that's a language, religion, culture, territory, sense of shared history, or sort of subjective aspects that people believe that they're part of a nation. What the Soviets found is that when they had these criteria, for nations, but no one fit them. So they actually had to make the decision of who's going to be a nation. Why do Chechens not get the same level of autonomy as Azerbaijanis? Why do Volga Tatars not have the same level of autonomy as Ukrainians? So in reality, this started to get really complex because nobody ever fits this objective criteria. Although for a nation to exist, there has to be some kind level of objective integration. So the Kurds are divided internally, just like the same applies for all the Middle Eastern communities, whether we're talking about Persians, whether we're talking about Kurds, Arabs, Turks. There was, these groups had some kind of commonality between themselves before the modern era, but it took self-conscious nation building to forge them into nations. Eric Hobsbawm has a famous kind of quote where he says, nations don't make nationalisms and states. Nationalisms and states make nations. And I would add to that, and sometimes they make the wrong nation because they annoy a bunch of people so that they suddenly start feeling themselves to be actually a nation. So it's just like
that's right. I think, and I like that point about the wrong nation at the end, because this is something that always annoys the shit out of me when I'm arguing with Zionists and they'll say oh, Israel has a right to exist. It's like, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to say, did Czechoslovakia have a right to exist? Did the Confederacy, various nation states exist at various times, and that might or might not serve the needs and the aspirations and be just towards various people who live in those territories who might have their own ideas about what they'd like the national arrangements to be. And whatever the principles are that you use to adjudicate all of that, surely whatever nation states the world happens to be divided into at any given time have a right to remain so forever. Is clearly not one of them.
Well, with that particular statement as well, I often see it as a kind of rhetorical trick to try and justify a kind of Jewish supremacy over this shared territory, which both Jews and Palestinians have a historical right to live in, and a claim to. So that, when you say, I used to always say, I believe in Israel's right to exist, but now I'm like, no. Just as I don't believe in a kind of ethnically pure Palestine from the river to the sea, I don't believe in a Jewish state. I believe, it's up to the people in the region, but I don't see any realistic solution beyond some kind of shared state over this commonly held territory. And that gets to the question of nationalism per se, because of course, you have ethnic communities in the past, and some of those ethnic communities are welded into nations. Some become parts of other nations. For example, in Britain, the Cornish have their own language, they have their own history, but they're not regarded as a separate ethnic group or anything anymore because they've been integrated into a concept of Englishness. The Scots are historically divided between Irish immigrants in the north, the Gaelic speakers, and the Anglo-Saxon speakers in the south, but history has forged a sense of Scottish nationhood out of a set of diverse groups. And the same can be said about the Kurds. You have a diverse set of communities that historically had some kind of conception of a shared Kurdish identity. Then in the 19th and 20th century, intellectuals, political activists reconceptualized their community as a nation. And
and I should just say here, right? So just to maybe be annoyingly pedantic and circling and underline the point, right? If you have, if linguistic distinctness and linguistic uniformity, for example, is an important criteria, then look, is Canada a nation? Some people speak English, some people speak French.
Is India a nation?
Is India a nation, given the hundreds of languages spoken in
Switzerland a nation? Well, we have a problem in the English language.
And are the United States and Canada separate nations? They certainly don't. You certainly wouldn't think so if you used Stalin's checklist, but I don't think the Canadians would appreciate, being annexed into the United States, and even beyond the healthcare issue. So I think that there's a real problem there. Presumably the way to think about this stuff is not who is quote unquote objectively a nation, as if this were some one of Plato's joints you could carve the world into, but who considers themselves to have a collective national identity, who crucially is considered by the people who might currently be running the nation states that they're in to be in a separate category and thus treated differently out of the basis of that. And then given those ground level facts, what sorts of national arrangements would be democratically legitimate and lead to, as little human misery as possible. I mean, presumably those are the relevant questions, when you're thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where it comes down to. And it doesn't mean that, when you look at the national question, it doesn't mean that, the only resolution to a national question is for national independence, but that has to be recognition of national rights and grievances and some kind of arrangements to defuse those issues. Consider the United States. There is a very strong case to be made that African Americans, Black Americans, are a distinct ethnic group. And when we say Black, of course, today we include, newer immigrants from Africa and places like that. But often the historical experience of Black immigrants from Nigeria is different from Black Americans. There's a very specific Black American experience. You could make the case that the Black people of America are a nation. And indeed, during the civil rights movement, the big conflict was between a separatist vision of a Black nation in America and an integrationist mission in which sought to achieve the full rights of Black Americans within a broadened concept of what it meant to be America.
Yeah, and, back in the 1930s, both the Stalinist and Trotskyist wings of the American communist movement, I would say, somewhat under the influence of Russians who didn't necessarily have a good grasp on the complexities of the issue, held the position that the so-called Black Belt, where the African American population was then mostly concentrated, was a distinct nation, that should be recognized as having a right to national self-determination, etc. And then there are residues of that position even much later. The SWP that you mentioned. Had a kind of alliance with Malcolm X at one point later that they understood through the prism of that analysis that Trotsky had given them in the 30s. Although even by then, clearly any sort of claim that you could make about because integration was already becoming a thing, because even before the end of legal segregation, the New Deal and the rise of industrial unions, had created all these incentives for Black Southerners to migrate to the North, and it had long since ceased to make sense in any kind of geographical way. All of which is just to say, put down the Stalin and think about it. But as far as thinking about it in the Kurdish context, and you say that by like the 1970s, you'd started to have this specific kind of national conception and nationalist movement.
Well, I mean, basically, at the elite level, you have it, beginning in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You see the first wave of Kurdish political activism coming into the fore following the 1908 constitutional revolution in the Ottoman Empire, which gave a lot of opportunity for peoples in the Middle East to openly, discuss national issues. Doesn't mean they were separatists. There was most Muslim minorities in the Ottoman Empire, for example, regarded themselves as nations, but saw their futures as being tied together within a kind of constitutional, supranational, multinational polity, not too dissimilar from tendencies within the Austro-Hungarian Empire or tendencies within the Russian Empire at that point. Now, after the end of the First World War, of course, the Middle East got partitioned into explicit nation states. The Ottoman Empire was, an empire. It was, there was an attempt to forge a kind of Ottoman national identity, but that had some success, more success than people give it credit for. But once the empire collapsed, you have the formation of new identities. You have explicit Arab nation states and you have explicit Ottoman nation states, but at the same time, you also have the Arabs being partitioned amongst themselves with Syrians and so on and so forth. So you have this conflict in the Arab world, for example, between the Qawmiya nationalism, the nationalism of sort of race and language and culture, and the Wataniya nationalism of territorial states. So sort of pan-Arab nationalism versus kind of nation-state nationalism. And the Kurdish movement kind of parallels that in an interesting way, because although there are no Kurdish states, you have this sort of split, not between kind of the cultural divides amongst the Kurds, not so much based on culture or dialect, but based on which political state they lived in. So, for example, the two main dialects of Kurdish are Kirmanji and Sorani. Sorani is spoken in Iran and Iraq, and Kirmanji is spoken mainly in Turkey, Syria, but also in Iran and Iraq. But, you know, you don't see Kirmanji nationalism and you don't see Sorani nationalism. Rather, you see different Kurdish nationalisms with different political orientations developing within each of these states, despite these kind of let's say, primordial divisions. So the divisions that do exist within Kurdish nationalism today are either ideological or they're based on the international frontiers because, you know, the political conditions that prevailed in Turkey, Iraq, and Iran were different. They affected the Kurdish. In all those countries, the Kurds were kind of discriminated in, but in different ways, which affected the political orientation of those movements and gave rise to, you know, if we do want to talk about a multiplicity of Kurdish nationhoods today, we can talk about maybe like you have this kind of pan-Kurdish nationalism, which is powerful amongst the diaspora, which is aspirational amongst many Kurds. But then you have a kind of a more institutionally powerful kind of territorial version of Kurdish nationalism, which is a Kurdish nationalism in Turkey, Kurdish nationalism in Iraq, a Kurdish nationalism in Iran, and a Kurdish nationalism in Syria, all of which have their own specificities and political orientations and political organizations.
Yeah, well, let's talk about some of the political organizations, right? So, like, I think one of the first acronyms you mentioned, and something that people who might know a little bit of this are likely to have heard of, is the PKK. So what's that, and when did it get started?
Sure. So the PKK emerged in the late 1970s in Turkey. And Turkey is home to the largest population of Kurds. And the PKK was very much regarded itself as a pan-Kurdish movement. So it argued for the complete independence of Kurdistan and the creation of a united independent Kurdistan. They received support from Syria in their early days. So they actually, initially, they excluded Syria from their Greater Kurdistan plan. And in fact, they even accepted the Syrian government narrative at the time that most of the Kurds in Syria originally came from Turkey, so they weren't really Syrians, because, you know, Kurds in Syria, many of them were stripped of their citizenship and you know, what kind of citizenship, without citizenship. And the Syrian government allowed Syrian Kurds to join the PKK to kind of distract them, sending them over to Turkey to cause trouble with Turkey, which was their rival. So the PKK emerged as this kind of left-wing, very traditional kind of Marxist-Leninist style political party.
Yeah, so that stands for Kurdish Workers' Party.
Kurdistan Workers' Party. So yeah. Interestingly enough, most Kurdish political parties don't call themselves Kurdish, they call themselves Kurdistan. So they have a very strong territorial aspect to it. And this left-wing political orientation, the very strikingly left-wing political orientation of the Kurdish movement in Turkey, is not haphazard or accidental. When the Republic of Turkey was founded, initially the Kurdish movement in Turkey kind of grew out of discontented tribal leaders who were angry at state centralization, secularization, and sort of cultural oppression, and intellectuals who were angered by an exclusion from state institutions, political persecution, and so on and so forth. So you have this kind, in the 20s and 30s, you kind of have this alliance between intellectuals and tribal leaders. However, the Turkish Republic, especially after the 1930s, was very good at assimilating tribal leaders and landowners into the Ankara regime. So this kind of traditional ruling class of Kurdish society, many of them were integrated into Turkish political parties. And this, again, alienated intellectuals who were like, we don't, you know, why is this uneducated tribal leader being the parliamentarian for Van just because he can convince 2,000 people from his tribe to vote for him, and he owns, you know, 50 hectares of land, he gets, but we went to university and stuff. So you have this kind of alienated left-wing Kurdish intelligentsia who's very attracted to communist revolutionary movements. At the same time, you have some of these Kurdish tribal leaders attempt within the constitutional framework of Turkey to get like more resources for the Kurdish region, to have the government loosen up on the very, very harsh cultural restrictions placed on Kurdish language and printing and things like that. So you have this kind of constitutional kind of do it within the system wing represented by kind of tribal leaders who try and say, hey, don't be so brutal to Kurds. And then this kind of left-wing intelligentsia. Both these movements fail by the 1970s. The left-wing movement is crushed in Turkey, and also the Kurds are kind of pissed that the left is not really taking the Kurdish question super seriously. And also this kind of Eastism movement, they call it Doğuculuk, this kind of like, let's solve the economic issues, let's do this. This also kind of fails. And so the PKK emerges a kind of like a maximalist cultural Kurdish nationalists and maximalist sort of communists at the same time. And in 1980, there's a coup. A lot of Kurdish groups are kind of arrested. PKK manages to survive that. Then it starts like attacking other Kurdish groups, such as the Kurdistan Socialist Party, for being reformists, and launches a guerrilla warfare in 1984. Launches this huge fight against the Turkish state, which gains a significant degree of popular support. By no means like the dominant strain amongst Kurdish political thought, but it becomes a very attractive movement, and places itself within this anti-imperialist struggle as they are fighting Turkey, which they will, were like, Turkey is NATO's largest army. So you have the emergence of this left-wing orientated movement. Of course, in the 90s and beyond, things get a little bit more complicated because the Soviet Union collapses. So the ideological kind of divide in which the PKK was created, doesn't kind of fit anymore.
Yeah. So I do want to just dwell on this for a minute, right? Since my understanding, which is hazy, is that after the fall of the Soviet Union and that kind of like orthodox, Soviet Marxist Leninism, stops being quite so attractive. That later some of these leaders actually drift towards being influenced by this American radical Murray Bookchin, who is this kind of eccentric quasi-Marxist, quasi-anarchist. So I mean, can you just speak briefly to what the ideological drift is there?
Sure. So in the early 90s, the PKK begins to soften its line. It begins pushing for autonomy within the nation states instead of full independence. We also at the same time see the emergence of a parliamentary wing to the Kurdish movement. There are several Kurdish political parties or Kurdish-orientated political parties that operate within the parliamentary system but are shut down. The HDP, which is the most recent iteration of this, is one of them. So there's this kind of moderating in the 1990s. But in 1999, the Turkish government basically forces Syria to expel Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK, and a very, very there's an individual who had established a very powerful cult of personality, in the PKK. PKK was very authoritarian and centralized, and Öcalan himself was, a very jealous god of the Kurdish movement. He goes to Italy, and eventually he ends up in the Greek embassy in Kenya, where Turkish special forces capture him, take him back to Turkey, put him on trial, and he goes to jail. And in jail, he has apparent mellowing and begins to, read stuff like Murray Bookchin and, talk about feminism and eco-environmentalism. And he kind of develops this ideology of democratic confederalism, which is basically kind of his take on a kind of municipal anarchism, where you would have like power devolve to the lowest levels. You would have like women's organizations, sort of women's councils and things like that. Like you can go into democratic confederalism very deeply, but think of it as a kind of municipal autonomy ideology where you have like things devolved to the lowest level, and you have strong women's representation and a strong concern for the environment. Cooperatives are a big thing. So it's not exactly classical socialism or Marxism, but it's a kind of anarchistic radical liberalism that you might want to look at. And of course, fast forward to 2010, it becomes the 2010, 2011, with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, it becomes the governing ideology of the Kurdish enclaves in northern Syria, with many of these veterans who had fought with the PKK against Turkey returning during the civil war, and with the kind of acceptance of the Syrian government taking over certain Kurdish enclaves in the north of the country. So you move away from this like very traditional kind of like hardline Marxist-Leninist national self-determination, built on the concept that Kurdistan is a colony. It needs to be decolonized. It's partitioned, and it has to be unified, towards a kind of an idea that the PKK and its kind of sister organizations advocate that the nation state is a failed model, and we need to move to a post-national system. So when people call the PKK or the YPG in Syria, which has a common ideological origin to the PKK, nationalists, it's certainly true that a lot of their activists on the ground are, like Kurdish nationalists. They want to speak Kurdish, they want to do Kurdish stuff. But politically speaking, the organizations explicitly reject that model. And particularly in Syria, the YPG and the democratic forces see their model of municipal government as being a model, not just for the Kurds, but for the whole of Syria, and a way to resolve the national question within ethnically diverse societies. And there's a scholar called Amy Austin Holmes who's done significant research interviewing Arab members of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the umbrella organization of which the YPG forms the core, saying that many of these people are like, we don't agree with everything on the Kurds, but this kind of like municipal government and like having co-ops and having women, especially women, are like, this is really good. I don't want to have to like stay in the house all the time. I want to have a gun. I want to go like do these kind of things. So I don't know how far the buy-in is, but there is, people don't give that enough credit, but there is a certain buy-in from non-Kurdish communities with this ideology. So to a certain extent, I don't want to say something grandiose like the PKK and its descendants have like surpassed or transcended nationalist ideology. I think there's a lot of contradictions within the organization, but this ideology of democratic confederalism is an attempt to move beyond the kind of nation-state model to provide some kind of radical liberal experiment of municipal government, which they believe would provide a model for governance around the Middle East. This is very different from the movement in Iraq, which is a lot more what you would describe as a traditional nation-state nationalism.
Yeah, right. And I mean, in an odd way, right? I mean, you mentioned the Ottoman Empire earlier. I mean, obviously, it's an empire. It's very oppressive, but at the same time, I mean, part of how they were able to hold that together for as long as they did, as I understand it, was to obviously not in any sort of, admirably democratic way, but to in practice allow lots and lots of autonomy to people who held power in various local areas.
And I would take the parallel even further. This is something I've done in my scholarly work, is that a lot of this stuff about democratic confederalism is presented as being kind of a brand new ideology in the Middle East. And obviously it is novel, especially the left-wing orientation of it is quite novel. But in many ways, it echoes the ideologies of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the conception that various Middle Eastern communities, Armenians, Kurds, Arabs, Turks, can live together within the framework of a universalist constitutional system within the Ottoman Empire. So obviously, the superstructure, the structure in which this kind of brotherhood or egalitarian, this kind of national equality is achieved is very different. A constitutional monarchy is very different from a kind of anarchist commune, but the attempt to transcend national differences through accepting national differences as being fine and finding another framework in which to work is not an entirely new. And it's echoed in other nationalisms, including Iraqi nationalism. Before Saddam Hussein, there was a very strong Iraqiist tendency in Iraqi nationalism that both rejected Pan-Arabism and called for this formation of a very specific Iraqi identity that emphasized not so much the heritage of Arabia and Islam, but of the Babylonians, of the Sumerians, and of these ancient civilizations upon which the modern Iraqi people possess the legacy. So the PKK, the YPG, these are really interesting movements because of their kind of explicit journey away from nationalism as a kind in the traditional sense towards an ideology which, at least on paper, is explicitly anti-nationalist.
Yeah, no, that is actually, that's extremely interesting. So, okay, so I think we talked about one strand with the PKK leading up to current manifestation in northern Syria. Another acronym that you used earlier was the KDP.
Yep. So the KDP was it was a political organization originally founded in Iran in the late 1940s, and there are, in fact, to make things very confusing, there are multiple KDPs, and the two main KDPs are the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iraq and the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran. So what I was talking about is the Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, which today is the more famous one because they're the ones in Iraq, because they're the ones operating in Iraq. So we'll put the other one aside, although they have a shared origin. The situation in Iraq was, the British come in, they set up this country called Iraq, and they establish a monarchy. They bring in a guy from Arabia, a Hashemite from Arabia, plonk him on the throne of Iraq, and you have this kind of crippled regime where there are like parliamentary forms, and there's like kind of like modern institutions, but the British control things from one end, and on the other end, tribes have enormous amount of power. The British in many ways made the same, and I think I mentioned this when we were talking on the live stream before, just as the Americans kicked out anyone who had an association with the Ba'ath Party because they saw them as a corrupt, the British kind of excluded many of the officials who'd worked for the Ottoman Empire because they assumed they were all corrupt and untrustworthy, even though they sort of were like the main people who knew how to do administration. They have this kind of crippled state, which is eventually overthrown in 1958, and we have like a series of revolutionary governments and coups and counter coups up until the late 60s, where Saddam Hussein comes to power. So where do the Kurds fit into this? Well, at the very initial phase of state formation in Iraq, Kurdish notables resisted, particularly Sheikh Mahmoud of Suleimania. He was a tribal leader, a religious leader as well, who led an uprising for a Kurdish state against the British. He was eventually beaten, and most of the Kurdish aristocratic classes kind of accepted monarchical rule, and you have this kind of situation. But obviously, some of the tribes don't get on with the government. One of those tribes were the Barzani tribe. The Barzani tribe have a long, complicated history. They were originally a millenarial movement in the late 19th century who kind of evolved into a tribe. They were initially a kind of socialistic group as well, a reaction against the extremely stratified social hierarchies that existed in some of the mountainous regions in what is today northern Iraq. Anyway, this tribe has trouble with the trouble with the Ottoman government. They hook up with some Kurdish nationalists during the Ottoman period. Then in the 30s and 40s, they have problems with the Iraqi government. And eventually, Mullah Mustafa Barzani, one of the leaders of the group, he flees to Iran, and a whole bunch of complicated things later. There is a pro-Soviet Kurdish republic briefly established there, where Mullah Mustafa is appointed the kind of leader of. After that is crushed by the Iranian central government in the late 1940s. He flees to the Soviet Union, and he stays there until 1958, when the Iraqi Revolution happens. He comes back to Iraq, invited by the new revolutionary government. They're the kind of intellectuals who kept the fires on in the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which had been founded in that pro-Soviet republic. And the reason it was called the Kurdistan Democratic Party was because, according to two-stage revolutionary theory, before Kurds could have a proper socialist party, they needed to have a bourgeois democratic revolution and establish a national democratic regime. So the Kurdistan Democratic Party was established. One branch ended up becoming like a separate party in Iran. The other branch organized secretly during the latter days of the monarchy in Iraq, run by intellectuals. Mullah Mustafa comes back from the Soviet Union, this tribe leader, this war hero guy. And he does the classic, everybody underestimates him because they think he's like a dumb tribe guy. The intellectuals all put him in charge of the political party, and then he kind of kicks all their asses. He eventually falls out with the government in 1961. And between 61 and 71, you have this ongoing civil war. Sometimes the intellectuals, the intellectual wing of the party led by a guy called Ibrahim Ahmed, and then later Ibrahim Ahmed's son-in-law, Jalal Talabani, who was a lawyer and who was a personal friend of Christopher Hitchens. They sometimes side with the Iraqi government, but eventually in 71, the KDP and the Iraqi government sign a peace agreement. There's this attempt to create an autonomous region, but that falls to bits in 1975, and the KDP splits into the Kurdistan Democratic Party, which remains in the hands of, Mullah Mustafa lives until 1979. And ironically, for someone who returned to Iraq from the Soviet Union, he flees to the United States and dies in Langley, Virginia in 1979. He'd sustained his revolt with support from the Shah, with the support from Nixon. And in fact, people often think 1991 was the first time the Americans had sold out the Kurds. They actually sold them out in the 1970s as well, when they turned the tap off from the for the uprising against the Iraqi central government. Long story short, the KDP continues to fight during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and the PUK, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, this more left-wing split from the KDP, which rejects the kind of tribal nature of the KDP, also fights. And they both get Iranian support during the Iran-Iraq War, but they're kind of screwed by the end of the Iran-Iraq War. And Kurdistan is in a pretty tough situation. Saddam Hussein launches a genocidal campaign against the Kurds. There's large-scale ethnic cleansing. But the Kurds are granted a reprieve when Saddam invades Kuwait. That fails. The Kurds rise up. The Kurds are crushed again by the Iraqi central government. But the United States is kind of humiliated by this, so they want to do something. Turkey doesn't want 2 million Kurdish refugees fleeing in there because they're busy fighting the PKK. And as you might guess, 2 million Kurdish refugees living in camps on the border is going to be prime PKK recruiting territory. So they consent to the creation of an autonomous Kurdish region, and the KDP and PUK kind of split that region up. There's a brief civil war, they basically going from being guerrilla organizations to being the governing parties in northern Iraq. This continues through the invasion of Iraq. They side with the Americans, and that continues to be the case today. And the KDP and the PUK are now both governing parties. The leadership of both those parties are now extremely wealthy individuals who have made a lot of money from oil contracts, smuggling, skimming money off the top, doing this. So they basically they definitely have more legitimacy than the Iraqi central government used to have, but I like to call it like liberal Baathism. So you have like you have the same kind of political economy of patronage and oil money as you did with the Ba'ath Party, but you know the KDP and PUK don't have to be so violent because they have kind of more innate legitimacy amongst their people, and they have, at least until recently, been able to kind of obfuscate the lack of democracy and the failure of democratic consolidation since 1991 in the autonomous region through economic growth. And you had, I was there in 2004, and I moved back 10 years later, and I cannot describe to you how different this, just physically everything looked. It was like, when I was there in 2004, it was like, dusty, Wild West buildings which hadn't been renovated for at least, 2 decades. And now you have like fancy Turkish hotels, TGI Fridays, and you have KFC, which costs $200.
Yeah, fair enough, right? The sort of the difference maybe between sort of like I always think of like I've been to I was in Cuba, and a few years after that I was in China, and and they're both capital C communist countries that have had much more so in the Chinese case, right, some degree of market reforms, but they could not be more different, right, in terms of how it feels to walk around in one of them, because Cuba is in this kind of eternal 1970s. And walking around, and even where I was in Jilin in China, which is like almost up by the border with North Korea, it could be like a lot of that could be a Chinese neighborhood in an American city, in terms of just like the chain restaurants everywhere. And
exactly. I mean, it was a radical change fueled by an oil boom. Like there was the Kurdish political parties. They very much viewed themselves within the nation-state model. So they established they got constitutional recognition for their autonomous region. And there was a failed attempt in 2017 to push for full independence, which went wrong for them. But, even though they failed the referendum, the autonomous region still exists.
Yeah, which and it's worth thinking about this, because we watched that clip of Hitchens earlier talking about the Kurdish struggle as his reason to support the invasion of Iraq. But I mean, just kind of brass tacks. If you think, okay, so what's the goal here, right? If the goal is democracy, then clearly mission not remotely accomplished. If the goal is national independence, well, that hasn't happened either. There's no Kurdish, there's no Iraqi Kurdish state. There's Iraqi Kurdish local autonomy, but then again, that already existed in the 90s because of the no-fly zone. It seems like, as you pointed out, when you and me and David Slavic watched Christopher Hitchens' debate about Iraq with his brother Peter, then like really the big difference, right? I mean, you're talking about that oil boom and all that stuff is the economic effects that existed on Iraqi Kurdistan in the 90s of the sanctions that were on Iraq in general.
Yeah, I mean, if you had been in, let's say, in the year 2000, been someone like, look, we need to do something about the Kurds in Iraq. We really care about them. You could have done it without invading the whole of Iraq. You could have pressured Turkey to make trade easier, to have normalization, and had a whole Taiwan situation going on where there was no need necessarily. I mean, there were disputed territories, of course, and some Kurdish territories, predominantly Kurdish territories, were still under Iraqi rule, but there was the nucleus of Kurdish autonomy there. So
right. So Taiwan is a really nice reference point there, since without actually formally declaring independence, from China, it's big, became over the course of decades, especially since the fall of the dictatorship there, extremely prosperous and successful de facto nation state with American backing, including in fact, honestly, ironically, since Taiwan was founded as a as a right-wing anti-communist enclave, at this point they actually have a really extensive social democratic welfare state that's allowed them to be one of the best performing countries in the world with the pandemic.
And having a Taiwan is much better than having a permanent state of war with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, exactly, right. So certainly, in the Iraq analogy, right, if you could, you could have this model without starting this immensely bloody war that led to mass civilian casualties even originally, and brutal, basically, devolved the whole country into long-term chaos, and miniature civil wars, and led to, awful spillovers, in Syria, and all kinds of bloodshed and destabilization that we're still dealing with nearly 2 decades later. So the price tag is unspeakable, and the advantages of doing that, as opposed to just economically normalizing the de facto autonomous part of Iraq, is pretty
and doing other things like this. I think one of the things that Americans have a problem with, especially within the foreign policy establishment, is that they think America is a superpower in the sense that it can, American power can be deployed and you can do anything. Sometimes there is not much you can do. And sometimes the thing that America can do is the thing that America doesn't want to do. And what I mean by that is, like, look, let's move away from the Kurds for a second, talk about Afghanistan just for one moment. We have a choice, like we stay in Afghanistan or we leave Afghanistan, right? And both are going to be, there's going to be like pretty bad fallout from either. The war in Afghanistan is a disaster. America should not be in there bombing people and things like that. But let's be under no illusions. A big pullout could very well have a return to the situation in the 90s, which was not fun for anyone either. So what can America do in that situation? Well, maybe they can pull out, but also allow every single Afghan who wants to come move to the United States, right? That would be the solution, right? With something like the Kurdish question, you could pressure Turkey, which is your NATO ally, to do something about that and resolve that question. But, you could say, like, with Iran, instead of like permanently trying to, destabilize the country and risk turning it into another Syria, maybe instead just make it a lot easier for Iranians to come live in the United States and be refugees in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is actually a real historical example of something like this, which is the end of the Vietnam War, at which point, the United States did accept mass migration, from anti-communist Vietnamese. And I don't, I'm sure somewhere out there, there's some deranged Reaganite who would agree, but I think it'd be very difficult for most sane people to say that that out of the available options, is continuing the Vietnam War for God knows how many more years or decades
would have made sense.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. America can do things to do these remedy these situations. They're just not the ones that make Lockheed Martin a lot of money, or make people feel powerful. And generally the most positive solutions that America could involve in have a potential political cost, because people don't make the case for, like, America has plenty of room. You could have, like, Germany accepted 1 million Syrian refugees. There's no reason the United States couldn't accept 4 million Afghans or a million, or a million Kurds from Turkey and things like that. So, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, and I think that's also something that's worth. I think that's a point that doesn't often get made, but it's one worth emphasizing. That there's I'll
resist the temptation to draw analogies to other situations. But I think that oftentimes, you get these debates that are framed as, oh, should we do something or should we do nothing? And very, very, very often there is an option to to do something, but just not the something that the people who say do something actually want to do. And I think that's really worth that's really worth keeping in mind. Because I think that that if you allow these things to be framed as, do you support grisly and bloody imperialist wars, or do you allow, or do you just allow, crimes against humanity to happen with nothing, nothing being done about them, by official enemies, that framing is often really a gift, to people who want to do, who want to start new wars, and I think that we shouldn't give them that gift, that accepting refugees is doing something, lifting sanctions, is doing something, engaging in, diplomatic pressure, with Turkey, and that's, in that example, is doing something. These are all some things that you can do without invading anybody or bombing anybody. I think the American left needs to be better at making that case. But this is, I'm sure, as people say at the beginning of interminable, Twitter threads, one of question mark. So we will return to all of this and do more installments of this. But thank you so much, Gene. This was really good.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for hosting me. It's always great to talk to you.
All right. Thanks, Gene. Left is best.
Left is best.